Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Ghost Rider. He was the character that was data mined for the mid-month update, but ended up landing in the seasonal event as a seasonal uniform. I did end up saving my materials when I heard about the data mine, since Ghost Rider was already pretty decent before in PvE, and the fact that he had an iframe ignore means that he could function as a hybrid character, but I never expected him to be as good as he is with this current upgrade. Not only is he just insanely strong in PvE, but they also kept his iframe ignore and even shortened the cooldown and gave him an artifact with the immortality effect, which effectively also makes him PvP depending on how you build him. There's a lot of testing footage to cover, so I won't waste too much time, but I'll basically say just outright that of the characters I've tested this year, this is probably the strongest and best one, and I would easily recommend to anyone in the game. Similar to my other videos, all the PvE testing that I did is without a damage proc, just for consistency and to show you how good his base kit is. In terms of the PvE build, you pretty much have two main options, either a CTP of Rage or a CTP of Judgment, though the divide isn't as massive as it would be on other characters. A CTP of Rage will more than likely be his most ideal option overall for score-based modes. I'm not sure if it is the strongest compared to a Judgment, but I know that the character is really strong as a striker, and by using a CTP of Rage, he effectively becomes the strongest striker in the game for score-based modes in general. With that said, if you're not really competitive in ABX and ABL modes, I think that a CTP of Judgment would provide more value overall across multiple modes. The character doesn't have too much fire damage in his kit as is. I believe it's only around 30%, so you won't hit the cap immediately. However, the effectiveness of the Judgment does drop off a little bit once you get to T4, since he gets additional fire damage from resistances with the T4, and you're probably going to end up using supports that also provide fire damage, since those are the best ones for him, and for that reason the effectiveness does drop off a little bit. However, you're getting the added value of the character performing a little bit better in War Boss Legend, and if you choose to use him in PvP as somewhat of a hybrid, he does gain an edge versus characters with high element resistances, like Jean Grey for example, because the CTP of Judgment reduces resistances. Alternatively, you could even use a single skill damage proc if you wanted. He is somewhat proc friendly, though you do have to delay cancel his ultimate, so it doesn't function as well as the other options. If you're on a budget, then you can even use one of those mini rage obelisks with fire damage, and it should function pretty well since the character is really strong as is even without a build. You can see that because he completed stage 9 of Null without a leadership or support pretty much in 60 seconds, and then on stage 24 with the same conditions, he completed it within roughly 2 minutes and 30 seconds. That's pretty crazy because some of the characters that I've tested previously are hardly able to complete it with about 60 seconds remaining. If you're wondering how the old uniform compares, I was barely able to complete the first phase in under 2 minutes, and I did end up dying because this uniform doesn't have any healing. The reason I'm showing this is because the T4 does give him healing, so some people might consider using this uniform instead of the new one, but you can see that the new one is clearly much better than the old one. Initially, when the patch notes dropped, a lot of people suspected that Ghost Rider might just be a PvP character now, since he didn't get damage accumulation added to his kit, he got that immortality artifact, and the cooldown on his iframe ignore got reduced. However, his current setup is much better than getting damage accumulation, since he has attack increases on several of his skills, and he has that crazy 120% damage increase to supervillains, and an additional 150% damage increase once he hits supervillains with the 4th skill, so you don't have to waste time just building up the damage accumulation buff, you simply just get it right away. That's why the character functions so well at level 70 with his base kit. Once you're able to get him to level 80, he just becomes absolutely insane, since he can ignore all those penalties that the boss applies to him when he was at a lower level. You can clearly see that in this clip. I don't have a damage proc, a leadership, or a support, and he's still able to clear stage 69. It seems like with every patch now, there is a chance that we get a really strong level 70 character that just becomes really powerful at level 80, despite the fact that they might not have their T4, but I think that Ghost Rider might be the strongest level 80 character in the game now. He's just really good with that support passive to fight villains, and the majority of the bosses are villains. He also gains that massive 150% damage increase as well, and on top of that, he is a universal type, so he doesn't get a penalty there. And he has the leadership tag and can use a whole bunch of other supports that can increase either element damage or fire damage or whatever else. He was easily able to clear all of the highest World Boss Legend stages that I had previously unlocked for that restriction, that I would have had to use characters with damage procs on them, but Ghost Rider was able to do it without one. I was even able to basically complete stage 24 of Jean Grey. I only came up short by about 2 bars, but that's because I messed up the rotation with his ultimate. I think that he could easily have completed this with a few seconds remaining, which is insane that a character can do this on stage 24 at level 80 and without a damage proc. The other thing I found pretty surprising was that when I took him into a giant boss raid, I was able to solo Dormammu with about 6 minutes remaining, and the reason that that was so crazy to me is because I've taken other characters at level 80 with damage procs, and they've been able to complete this with about 4 minutes remaining, sometimes 5 minutes, and he's doing it almost a minute to 2 minutes faster without a damage proc. At this point, you might be wondering whether the T4 actually makes a significant difference for him. There have been other characters that have been pretty strong at level 70 and 80, characters like Odin and Doctor Strange, for example, but their T4 just didn't really add much to them, and for a lot of people, it wasn't worth it. I think I can say with a good amount of confidence that the T4 does make a significant difference for him. The fact that his fire damage, which they call flame for some reason on the T4, I'm pretty sure it's a typo since I haven't really seen that anywhere else besides resistances being named as flame, but the fact that his fire damage can increase from flame resistances means that you can scale up the T4 damage in the long term once you can get more stats and things. On top of that, the character gets a solid offense increase with his stat bump, which for me was around 20,000 energy attack, and the strikers definitely help in things like ABX and ABL, especially when you have to use characters for the cancel effects. Not to mention that if you plan on using the character for PvP or even as a hybrid, that stat bump combined with the immortality artifact will allow him to reach that T4 skill more often, and usually the striker from that skill can potentially wipe out a full team. In terms of the strikers to use, Black Widow is probably one of the top options for PvE since the instinct type matches and you can get the max level, and on top of that she also has some usability in PvP. But for PvP specifically, I think that Spider-Man is slightly ahead of Black Widow because he also provides penetration in his striker skill. Either way, you can see from the World Boss Legend stages that I completed previously that pretty much all of them had about a 60-second or a 1-minute improvement from when he was just level 80. Initially, this might not seem as massive of an improvement as other T4s, but like I mentioned, as you can eventually get higher flame resistance or fire resistance, whatever they call it, then this does end up scaling higher because it is damage which is calculated to a greater extent than just getting kind of a basic attack increase. In fact, you can get a better sense of the improvement when I took him up against Jean, which was one of the higher stages and the more difficult ones for him without a damage proc, since he had almost a minute and 45-second improvement. Whereas for the other ones, it was about a minute improvement because he was already clearing them so quickly that oftentimes the animation or phase changes was restricting the overall improvement time that could be shown. I found Ghost Rider's performance in World Boss Legend impressive, but when I took him into ABX, I was actually quite shocked. I was able to hit over 14 million without a damage proc, and the reason that that's so crazy to me is because I wasn't able to hit that with a character like Odin at T4 with a Brilliant Judgment. I mean, I did get pretty close. I was able to score around 14 million with him even when I had a Brilliant Rage, but the fact that Ghost Rider can outscore him and even tie without a damage proc is absolutely nuts. Ghost Rider has all the cancel effects for the various ABX seasons, and I believe is only missing 1 or 2 for ABL, though once you get him to T4, you can just use a striker there instead, and it won't really matter anyway. Not only is the character meta for ABX on the Universal Hero Day, but I believe he's also meta in ABL on the Universal Male Day, if I'm not mistaken. Besides the fact that this character is now the best option for these particular days, if you end up having a CTP of Rage on the character, I believe he also becomes the best striker in the game for ABX and ABL combined. Just for reference, I was able to score 7 million with the character, which is only off by about a million compared to other characters that would have a leadership and support, but a CTP of Rage usually ends up providing a 2 million score improvement, so you can see that he is still well ahead of them. The rotation that I used for Ghost Rider was to quick cancel the first and second skill, so it fills up the ultimate in T4 faster. Then I do a delay cancel of the third skill when you see him kind of rise up a bit. Then you do a 5 cancel into the fourth skill to finish off. When you have your ultimate skill, you can delay cancel that first, and you usually do that once you see the flames start to appear, and then you go back into the rotation that I just mentioned. Once you have your T4 filled up, you can basically use that whenever it's ready. However, you might want to hold off sometimes when your skills are back off cooldown so that you can get the most out of it. You can also see that the T4 provides closer to that 2-minute improvement that I mentioned, since he cleared Giant Boss Raid by himself close to 2 minutes faster. With Ghost Rider doing so well in PvE, a lot of people have been asking me whether there's any point in building him for PvP, or in other words, whether he's meta. The short answer is that he is meta, but specifically for 3 vs 3 modes. For timeline, there would have to be at least 1 or 2 bans maybe of the top characters for him to be a viable top option in that mode. There are just way too many good characters in timeline for him just to easily jump into the top 3. To an extent, the same is true in Otherworld Battle, but in that mode, many more characters are kind of soft banned or there's penalties on them, so it's a lot easier for Ghost Rider to make the cut for the 5 characters on that team. His position in PvP is obviously dependent on whether you have his artifact, even a 3-star, since many characters that are meta in PvP either have 2 lives or they themselves have that immortal effect. For the testing that I did with Ghost Rider, I am using a 4-star version of his Immortal artifact and a mighty CTP of Conquest, but you can see that even at level 70, the character is capable of taking out top meta characters such as Gore, Hulk, and even Jean Grey, despite the fact that she has those element resists. An important thing to note is that if you don't have a damage proc on Ghost Rider, you might have to use a support when facing Jean, since her element resist is high enough if you're not using a support that you might struggle to take her out, because she might just end up locking you down before you can do that. Although Ghost Rider's kit is definitely good for PvP, he has a ton of great effects like that crazy villain damage, he has damage reduction, 2 skills with invincibility, super armor, healing, he has iframe ignore, super guard break on that iframe ignore skill, and even that immortality effect if you get his artifact. Despite the character having all of these great effects, one of the reasons why people might not use him in timeline specifically is because his iframe ignore skill, the 4th skill, kind of has a long cooldown on it. Many of the other meta characters that people usually use in timeline have a really short cooldown on their iframe ignore skill and can effectively just constantly spam it. In addition to that, the main damage dealing skill, again the 4th skill, has a bit of a long animation to it. Most of the other meta characters have very quick iframe ignore skills, like Jeans for example, Spider-Man. Wolverine has kind of a long animation, but he hides in the iframes, whereas Ghost Rider doesn't have an iframe for that. He can basically get hit and have that skill interrupted. Let's not forget about Warlocks, which is a very quick activation of the 2nd skill that can burst you down almost immediately. This kind of ties into the 3rd point, which is that he doesn't really have many iframes to hide in, so the opponent can target him, and even if he isn't taking much damage, they can fill up their ultimate and get their buffs up and eventually either whittle down his health or just take him out completely. The AI doesn't really help him too much in this regard because the 3rd skill that has the heal on it almost never really gets used. It's either the 4th skill that gets activated immediately, which again is the iframe ignore, or he goes into the 5th skill. Unless these 2 skills are on cooldown or kind of interrupted in some way, then he'll go into the 3rd skill, but for the most part it's not too bad. However, his survival does drop a bit because of it. Regardless of these shortcomings, you can see from these clips that he is definitely strong for PvP, and even with a 4-star artifact, there are times where he can pretty much just wipe out and win versus a full meta team of characters that can revive or even have the immortality effect. Even though the character doesn't have many iframes to hide behind and his skills can potentially get cancelled, they have a wide area of effect and linger for a good period of time even after he dies. If you paid close attention to those previous clips, you would have noticed that he took out full teams even after he died and the 5th skill was still up and dealing damage. In terms of the build to use on him, I went with a CTP of Conquest because I noticed that the damage he was dealing even without a proc was already high enough for him to take out opponents that weren't necessarily even supervillains. Normally, for a character that doesn't have too massive of a health pool and consistent healing, I would have used a CTP of Authority to help with that, but for Ghost Rider, he has 6 seconds of invincible across 2 of the skills that he opens with, so versus characters that have initial burst damage right away, getting invincible from the CTP of Authority won't really help, especially because you won't really proc the top option to help even more with that. So I went with a CTP of Conquest because that does provide the most survivability off the start, like when you go under 50% health. Besides that, because he doesn't have those frequent iframes, when that top proc occurs on the CTP, he will get reflect immunity, meaning that he won't instantly take himself out versus reflect characters when he uses his 4th skill. In addition, he gets that super guard break immunity, so he doesn't get knocked out of his skills as often, and also gains that added damage so that he's dealing enough damage versus non-supervillain characters. I would advise building the character more tanky than with a proc option because he already seems to do enough damage, and if possible, you want to extend the period of time before his artifact triggers so that he can activate his 4th skill more often and potentially wipe out the opponents. After the CTP of Conquest, I think that an Authority or a Refinement can also work. However, if you do want to build him with a damage proc option, I think that a CTP of Judgment is actually a pretty decent option despite the fact that you don't have guard break immunity, because like I mentioned earlier in the video, that element resist down on the CTP can help versus Jean Grey opponents that have high element resist. This is more of the hybrid option. The more PvP option would probably be something like a CTP of Greed. I also tested the character on manual in these following 2 clips just to show that you can definitely make him work in the current meta and facing some of the opponents that he has difficulty fighting, like Adam Warlock and Wolverine. Versus characters like Jean, you kind of want to switch out or just get some space between her so that when she's casting a skill, you can immediately go into your 4th skill, which will kind of lock her down with the super guard break, but also immediately take her out because of the high burst damage that you get from the passive and the 4th skill itself. After that, you want to move away and get some space again so that once she revives, you can go into your 5th skill to get that invincible and immediately cancel into the 3rd skill to get the iframe. For some reason, Jean's AI struggles to hit opponents with her own iframe ignore when they have invincible up and are in iframe themselves. The main goal when playing on manual is just to try and build up your T4 and ultimate while avoiding your artifact from triggering. So oftentimes you do want to just kind of spam your other skills so that you fill up those meters while having your 4th skill just one-shot the opponent. Because Ghost Rider doesn't have too many quick skills like the other metas, you want to use that T4 skill and the ultimate skill as your quick burst damage skill so that you can take out characters like Wolverine and Adam Warlock right away and either burn out their revive or their artifact as quickly as possible. Although Ghost Rider's performance in Timeline might not be that convincing of him being a meta, you can definitely see it in Alliance Conquest as he absolutely dismantles teams that have villains on them. He just instantly one-shots them off the start, and then he lives long enough with the artifact that usually never triggers to just clean up whatever's left. You can see from all 3 of these instances I'm showing versus meta villain teams that the artifact doesn't really trigger at all, and he just one-shots them right from the start with that 4th skill. Oftentimes they also have stacked supports on them, but the high villain damage that he has in his passive and the one that he gets from the 4th skill just kind of counters that even if you're not using supports. Versus Jean, he does end up one-shotting her as well, so effectively wiping the set, but because she has a revive and has that insanely annoying lockdown, you kind of need a high level artifact to survive long enough for his iframe ignore to activate again and clean up her 2nd life. If you're using Ghost Rider to counter Jean, you probably want to pair him with a reflect character so that his iframe ignore and the reflect damage, especially after she revives, is enough to wipe her out pretty quickly before she starts doing that lockdown nonsense. When a character ends up being meta and strong in PvP like Alliance Conquest, it's important to also look at ways to counter him since he will be kind of a nuisance and a problem later on when people have maxed out builds. One of the things that I initially tested was to use Odin's leadership because it provides that debuff higher element resist, and because he immediately goes into his skills that deal a good amount of damage, especially to Ghost Rider that doesn't have an iframe off the start when he uses his own 4th skill. I also paired Odin with characters that have long frequent iframes, so the opponent Ghost Rider can't hit them as often considering the long cooldown that he has on his own iframe ignore. And I also put Robbie Reyes on the team so that he can go into his Awaken skill after a long fight, considering that he can survive a good amount of time with that high fire resistance and immunity that he gets with Odin and himself. Considering the ban list for this week, I would say that Ghost Rider is meta in Otherworld Battle. Many of the other characters that have a revive or have the immortality effect either have their damage severely reduced or they take a massive amount of damage and just end up dying very quickly. He is one of the few characters, if not the only character with the immortal effect, that basically doesn't have any negative or penalties to his damage and survival. One other important thing to note that people often overlook is that the 4th skill doesn't actually provide 150% increased damage to supervillain types specifically. It activates when you hit supervillains and gains 150% increased untyped damage. That means that he gets 150% increased damage to all characters. So if the opponent team has a long surviving villain character like Carnage for example, he deals 150% increased damage to all characters for the duration of that fight as long as he's hitting Carnage. It also means that in things like Alliance Conquest, if the opponent uses Molecule Man to try to counter Ghost Rider, it won't work entirely. It'll only take off the top part, which is the passive of 120% increased damage to supervillains. Even still, I wouldn't really try to use Ghost Rider with Molecule Man or fight Molecule Man teams, since you do lose out on a massive amount of damage there. So you can clearly see from the footage that I showed just how amazing Ghost Rider is in PvE content and just how powerful he can be in PvP content. He is definitely meta in PvE, and I would say that he is meta in PvP as well, as long as you use him in the right times with a proper build. Again, his PvP dominance will be more limited to 3 vs 3 content, and in timeline you're not really going to want to prioritize him over some of the other better options like Jean Grey, Adam Warlock, and Wolverine. But once those characters are banned, then he becomes fair game. 2 quick things I wanted to mention is that for this character, unlike some of the other characters with immortal artifacts, I think that once you get him to a 6-star artifact, it will make a major difference because his iframe ignore has a longer cooldown. By having that extra 1 to 2 seconds of survivability, it could make a huge difference in the outcome of the match because he could potentially go into his iframe ignore again and wipe out the full team. Also, for those of you that can only pick up 1 uniform for the seasonal event, either Ghost Rider or Black Bolt, I would urge you to probably go with Ghost Rider just because he has so much more usability throughout most of the content in the game, and it's not sure whether Black Bolt will still be usable in alliance-based modes, with Loki potentially on the horizon and him being so good previously at level 70. Anyways, that pretty much does it for this one. There was a lot of content that I covered and I did put a lot of effort into this, so if you did like it, please consider liking this, subscribing if you haven't already, and possibly sharing it with other people since it might help them out as well, and it definitely helps my channel grow. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments section down below and I'll do my best to answer them. And as always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch these, so thank you, but the video is now over.